Okay, dear devotees, please accept my respectful obeisances or glory to the from the Prabhupada. Once again, we welcome you, Maharaj, to our Krishna Africa platform. So, dear
Hare Krishna.
devotees, it is our great honor and pleasure that we have today with us Maharaj to speak with us. We today will be treating Srimad Bhagavatam, second canto, chapter 8. We'll be reading text number 8.
Yeah,
So, Maharaj,
288.
exactly. So I'll put the verse on the screen, Maharaj, so we can start.
Okay. Okay, and I can share my screen too or not?
Yeah. If you want to, you can also, I can give permission to that. The
Okay,
verse is on the screen.
let me share my screen because
Okay, let me do that.
oh, I'm not able to share screen.
I'm giving the permission, Maharaj.
Okay.
Okay, you can share now, Maharaj.
Okay. Okay, so here is our verse for today, 2.8.8, Srimad Bhagavatam. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Okay, so this is 2.8.8. Asidyad udarat padmam lokasam sthana lakshanam yavan ayam vaipurusha iyat tavayavai pritak tavan asav iti prokta samstayavayavan iva Asidyad udarat padaman lokasam sthana lakshanam yavan ayam vaipurusha iyatavayavai pritak tavan asaviti prokta samstayavaya vavan iva samstavaya Vavan Eva. Okay, so the translation reads, if the Supreme Personality of Godhead, from whom, okay, good. If the Supreme Personality of Godhead, from whose abdomen the lotus stem sprouted, is possessed of a gigantic body, according to his own caliber and measurement, then what is the specific difference between the body of the Lord and those of common living entities? I'll read that again. If the Supreme Personality of Godhead, from whose abdomen the lotus stem sprouted, is possessed of a gigantic body, according to his own caliber and measurement, then what is the specific difference between the body of the Lord and those of common entities? Okay. So here's the purport. One should note how Maharaj Pariksit intelligently put questions before his spiritual master for specific understanding of the transcendental body of the Lord. It has been described in many places before this that the Lord assumed a gigantic body like that of Karna Dakshayi Vishnu, from whose hair pores innumerable universes have generated. The body of Garbhodakshayi Vishnu is described as sprouting the lotus stem within which all planets of the universe remain. And at the top of the stem is the lotus flower on which Lord Brahma is born. In the creation of the material world, the Supreme Lord undoubtedly assumes a gigantic body, and the living entities also get bodies, big or small, according to necessity. For example, an elephant gets a gigantic body according to its needs, and so also an ant gets its body according to its needs. Similarly, if the personality of Godhead assumes a gigantic body to accommodate the universe or planets of a particular universe, there is no difference in principle of assuming or accepting a particular type of body in terms of necessity. A living being and the Lord cannot be distinguished simply by difference in magnitude of the body. So the answer depends on the specific significance of the body of the Lord as distinguished from the body of the common living being. All right, so verse again was Asidyad udarat padamam lokasam sthana lakshanam yavan ayam vai purusha iyat tavaya vai pratak tavan saviti prokta samstaya vaya vavan iva. And the English is, if the Supreme Personality of Godhead, from whose abdomen the lotus stem sprouted, is possessed of a gigantic body, according to his own caliber and measurement, then what is the specific difference between the body of the Lord and those of common living entities? All right. So I'm going to stop sharing now. So this verse is explaining the questions that Parikshit is asking. In the very beginning of this chapter, Parikshit asked about the nature of the Supreme Lord. You know, please describe about the Supreme Lord. And then he also asked about hearing the narrations of the Lord. And he talked about how the Srimad Bhagavatam is giving people a chance to purify their heart. So if one hears Srimad Bhagavatam, the heart will be purified. And then in the previous verse, 2.8.7, we hear that the living entity is different than the Supreme Lord. So two questions are kind of important here. One of them is, how is the living entity different from the body? Because Parikshit asks, you know, how does the living entity come to accept a material body? If he accepts a material body, then he becomes conditioned by the material body. So how does that happen? And we are not the body. Spiritual life is about recognizing the fact that we are not the body that we are living in. But at the same time, the knowledge of spiritual life also distinguishes us from God. We are not the body, but we are also not God either. Both of those things are different. And we find out that the body of the Supreme Lord is different from the body of the individual, because the Supreme Lord, there's no difference between his body and his self. But for us, there is a difference between our body and ourselves. So we incarnated, which means that we took birth in a particular material body. That's what we did. We did that according to our karma. Later in Srimad Bhagavatam, we'll hear karmana daive netrena jantur deho papate strio pravishta udaran pumsamreta kanashaya. So that the living entity under the direction of the material energy, according to his past deeds, accepts a body given to him by material nature. It's under the supervision of material nature, and he accepts that body as a result of his past deeds. So he gets a body which is placed into the womb of a woman through a particle of male semen. So that's how the body is generated from a physical point of view. Everybody knows that well, but they don't understand where the body came from before it came out of the womb. So we are a combination. We have a spirit soul, which actually is who we are. We are the spirit soul. And we can accept a body. Because of our karma, we have been forced to accept a particular kind of body. So now we're in a body, and we are different from the body. So the body is material. The body is perishable. The body has various limitations. But we are not the body. Yet, because of false ego, we identify with the body, and we share those limitations, and we share that suffering that goes with identifying with the body. So that's our problem. Now, the Supreme Lord, there's no difference between his body and himself. There's no inside Krishna and outside Krishna. There's no, it's not like when Krishna dies, he leaves his body. There's no body to leave. Krishna comes to the material world in a body that's the same body that he always uses, it always has. It's a spiritual body. Now, the interesting thing is we too have a fully spiritual body. However, at the present moment, our material body is just a tiny particle. I mean, our spiritual body is just a tiny particle. So in the present feature, our spiritual body is just a tiny, like, spark, and it's seated in the heart of the material body. And this tiny spark has no perceptible form. However, at the time when we perfect our lives and we leave this gross body, then that spark enlarges into an actual form. We have a form. It may be the form of a gopi, or it may be the form of a peacock, or a cowherd man, or a cowherd boy, or whatever it is. We have all these possible things that we could be in the spiritual world. And when we go back to the spiritual world, we will learn what those things are. And right now, though, we have no idea. Right now, instead of having a spiritual form where there's no difference between the self and the form, we have a material body which is different from who we are. So the Supreme Lord has an eternal form. We have eternal form. But right now, that eternal form is within a gross body for us, but that doesn't work the same way for the Supreme Lord. He's not under that same restriction. So these questions are important to understand if one wants to make progress in spiritual life. As we saw in the end of chapter 19, or the later chapters of the first canto, we saw that many sages were collected around Parikshit Maharaj, who was obviously leaving his body. So they were there because they wanted to be there at that auspicious moment where Parikshit would leave his body. And he asked them for advice about what to do with his life. And they all began giving him different advice. So he was frustrated. Then Sukadeva Goswami came, and everybody saw immediately this person outclasses all of us. This person knows the absolute truth. So they put aside their arguments and their separate conclusions, and instead they said, "My dear Parikshit, you just ask this man, Sukadeva Goswami, and whatever he says, that is the best thing." So that's what they did. So all the various sages went into the background, and Parikshit began to ask only and specifically Sukadeva Goswami. And Sukadeva was able to answer his questions very nicely. So Sukadeva is the actual speaker of this part of Bhagavatam. Before, we were hearing the sages at Naimisharanya, and the sages of Naimisharanya were hearing what Sutta Goswami was speaking. It's a different situation there. At the beginning of Bhagavatam in the first canto, we heard the conversation between Sutta Goswami and the sages at Naimisharanya. But now we're hearing the conversation between Sukadeva Goswami and the sages on the Ganga, where we hear Sukadeva Goswami speaking to Parikshit. So in both cases, the questions are pretty much the same, or at least they're the same type of questions. The questions that we've been seeing so far are simple questions, but they're very profound questions. In the very beginning, Parikshit asks Sukadeva Goswami, how did Narada Muni, whose hearers are as fortunate as those instructed by Lord Brahma, explain transcendental qualities of the Lord, who is without material qualities, and before whom did he speak? So Parikshit wants to know, because we were hearing in the previous verses in chapter 7 of the second canto, that Narada Muni was inquiring from his father, Lord Brahma. And so Lord Brahma was answering Narada Muni. And now Narada Muni will go on in turn to instruct Vyasadeva and other people who are disciples of Narada Muni. And we want to know, the Lord has no material qualities, yet he's explaining the qualities. So how is it possible for the Lord to have qualities when he's said to have no qualities? The answer to that question, of course, is that the Lord has no material qualities. He definitely has qualities, and those qualities are transcendental qualities. So Parikshit asks Sukadeva Goswami in the next verse about telling the pastimes of the Lord and how those pastimes can be understood properly. So this is a good thing for all living beings to do, to learn pastimes of the Lord. Even just hearing about them, if we don't understand them properly or anything else, just hearing about them is purifying in itself. And then he begins to glorify Bhagavatam. So we hear a lot of good stuff about the Srimad Bhagavatam. And then Maharaj Pariksit asks about the difference between the material body and the transcendental self. That's what he asks in 287. And now in this verse, we hear that he's seeing that the Supreme Lord has a body. Now, for certainly for us in the Vaishnava tradition, the Supreme Lord having a body is not surprising information. But in many religions, it's a surprise. The reason it's a surprise is they believe that the Supreme Lord has just a non-feature, a non-form, like he's the white light. Or they think that the Supreme Lord is a very, very old man. And these are false conceptions of the Supreme. He certainly has an all-pervading form, the Brahma Jyoti, but that's not the most important feature of the Supreme. So the Supreme has many forms. He's multi-varied in his different kinds of expansions. And of course, we have the three expansions, the Mahavishnu, the Garbhodakshaya Vishnu, and the Kshirodakshaya Vishnu. And these are all Vishnu forms. They all have 4 arms. And they come from Krishna. So from Krishna comes Balaram. From Balaram comes the first Chaturvyuha. From the Chaturvyuha comes Narayan, and then another Chaturvyuha. Then we get the Purusha avatars, or Mahavishnu, sometimes also known as Garbhodakshaya Vishnu, Karnadakshaya Vishnu. Then we get Garbhodakshaya Vishnu. Then we get Kshirodakshaya Vishnu. So the Supreme Lord appears to have a gigantic form. And as Prabhupada said, what makes the form of the Lord different than our form? Well, it's not just because it's big, as Prabhupada puts in the purport. Krishna's form is very special. Now, it is true that the Purusha avatars, at least Garbhodakshaya Vishnu and Kshirodakshaya Vishnu, they only exist when the material universe is deployed, when it's unfurled, when the material universe is sucked back up into the body of Mahavishnu or Garbhodakshaya or Karnadakshaya Vishnu. That's what I'm trying to say, Karnadakshaya Vishnu. When it's sucked up there, then there's no need for a Garbhodakshaya Vishnu or a Kshirodakshaya Vishnu, because there's no creation going on. So in any case, the Supreme Lord's form may be way bigger than our form, but that's not the essential difference. The essential difference is the Supreme Lord has no duality. He is not himself and a body as well. Whereas we are different. We are ourselves and a body as well. We identify with the body, which we're not. So again, we're learning 2 important points here. One of them is that we're not the body. The other thing is that we're not God. We're neither the body nor are we God. The Mayavadis imagine that we are not the body, but we are God. And most common people imagine that we are, the Mayavadis imagine that we are the same as God, and common people imagine that we are the same as the body. Both are misconceptions. And to become free from those, we have to take up Krishna consciousness or spiritual life. So, of course, that's what the process of Krishna consciousness is all about, is understanding these things. And if one understands them, then one learns that we are not only not the body, and we're not only not God, but what are we? We are servants of God, and we learn how to serve God. And if we do that, then we become delivered from the material world, which is a place of misery and suffering. As we said in the beginning, that the material world is Asat, Achit, and Nirananda. It is not permanent, asat. It is not knowledgeable, achit, and it is not, it's nirananda, which means that it's not blissful. So when we come to the material world, everything is temporary. Things are not what they appear to be or what they can easily be understood to be, and things are miserable. So learning the difference between the self and the body is an important feature of spiritual life. And also learning that we are not the same as God is an important part of spiritual life. And then learning how to serve God is the next step. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions that we have.
Hare Krishna. Thank you so much, Maharaj. We apologize for the early technical hitches we were having, but so far it's okay now. Dear devotees, if anyone may have questions, comments, realizations you would like to share, you may unmute and go ahead and speak.
Yeah.
Maharaj, I have a question about, from the purport, the difference between the bodies of the living entities and that of the Supreme Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Like you were explaining in the deliberation that when I die, I leave my body here because I'm different from my body.
Right.
When Krishna comes and plays his pastimes and he winds up and goes back to the spiritual world, he does not leave his body here because the body is he himself.
Well, yes, some people have an issue there because there is the pastime of Krishna leaving his body with the story of the hunter,
Of the
Jara,
hand, yes.
and he shoots an arrow and it touches Krishna's foot, and Krishna uses it as an opportunity to leave his body. And he apparently leaves the body in the material world. And some say that that is just an expansion or a version of the material world itself is Krishna's body. But he apparently does that. But the whole purpose of that is to bewilder atheists.
Yeah.
But actually, Krishna's body, as we say, is Sat Chit Ananda. It's eternity, knowledge, and bliss. So there's no difference between Krishna and his body. And there's no difference between us and our body. But in the final issue, but right now we are incarcerated in a material body. So there is a difference between us and our body.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to find out is I am wondering how those who are eternally liberated, they come into this material world. When they come, putting Krishna's body aside, like the pure devotees, like Mother Yashoda, Rukmini, these are eternal associates of the Lord. So when they come down to this material world, do they assume material bodies, or they come down here with the same spiritual bodies they have in the spiritual world?
Well, that's a good question. And off the top of my head, I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. That I know Krishna comes in his original form.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Radharani comes in her original form. But we know that there are some associates who come and take apparently material forms in the material world. So I think there's some of both things happening, that some residents of the spiritual world come in their self-same spiritual form, but some also take material forms apparently to engage in pastimes in the material world. So they're not trying to enjoy like we are, but they apparently seem to have a material body.
Okay. Thank you so much, Maharaj. Tribhuvannath Prabhu, please, you may unmute.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to say, Maharaj, please accept my obeisance.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you for this analytic presentation of yours. Maharaj, my question concerns the last part of your presentation, is like a summary that the material world is not blissful.
Right.
So if we look at the world in general, we see that only a minute section of understanding, we can actually see that have this kind of knowledge that this place is not blissful and it's temporary. And a majority of people, they see this place as so rosary, so blissful, so fulfilling. So how do we, balance things
Right.
in such a situation? How do we, see, like a set of people have good understanding that there's no promising thing in this place, while majority of people are, here is the best place we have to be.
Well, the issue is, of course, that most people in the material world are unaware of any other option. They think this is the only place, so it's got to be the best place. If you have one option, it's got to be the best option because there aren't any other options. But that's not the same for us because we know there is another option. There's the spiritual world, and we learn scientifically how that spiritual world operates. Now, people may say that the material world is, blissful, but most people do their fair share of suffering because that's the way the material world works. We not only have some happiness in the material world, but we also nicely suffer at different times. And sometimes people are reluctant to admit that they're suffering because it looks bad for them. And other times, people may not even be aware that they're suffering because there's a tendency to just whitewash everything. We think that this material world is just wonderful. And we think that, at least when we're talking about philosophy, but in the dark dead of night, when we're home alone and things are not so nice seeming, then we admit to ourselves we're suffering and we have a miserable time here. So that's partly what it is. One answer of why people think that this is such a rosy, wonderful world is that they only think about the good times. There's a tendency of the mind to work like that too. When we're experiencing happy situations, we tend to identify with all the other happy situations that we have experienced in the past, as if the whole of existence has been a happy experience. Similarly, when we're very depressed and down, we experience the whole world as always being depressed, and that we were never happy at any time. And that's, of course, why people commit suicide, because they can only, for that moment, identify with the negative aspects of life. But in reality, we have both sides. And in reality, we have mostly a lot of misery, boredom, frustration, fear, and a tiny bit of happiness thrown in there, a tiny bit of pleasure thrown in there. But because we get a few chips of good feeling, of pleasure, then we assume that the whole thing is very nice. So that's kind of, some people are not aware of suffering there because they tune it out, or alternatively, the great solution for suffering in the material world is intoxication. So if we suffer, we get involved in intoxication through taking drugs. We find some relief from the pain. And while we're under the influence of the drug, whether it's alcohol or cocaine or whatever it might be, we feel a certain kind of happiness because we're dead to the pain. But then when the drug wears off, we see that our horrible life hasn't changed at all, and it's just gotten worse. And the next time we try to, overcome our material problem, we aren't able to do it so easily. Anyway, that's a couple of things I would say.
Maharaj, thank you. But at the same time, just like you emphasize on the concern of suffering. If suffering can have different categories,
Right.
the way the Vedic approach of suffering is quite different from the way different people see suffering. Because some people can see suffering as I'm not fast enough, that is why I'm suffering. Or I was not planning enough, that is why I didn't get it right, that is why I'm suffering.
Yeah,
But
right.
but it's a different approach entirely from the angle of the Vedas. The suffering is as a result of Krishna's mercy or as a result of one's previous actions. But we see that people don't see suffering the way we see suffering. They see suffering from a different perspective. Still, it still boils down to the question that I have asked. Well, I leave that, Maharaj. Thank you for your
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
you were saying some people don't actually see suffering, that they appear not to be suffering, or they think they're not suffering. But here now, we're not talking about how we suffer or don't suffer, but what the causes of suffering are. Well, that's, as you say, in the material world, everybody assumes the reason that they're suffering is because someone was angry at them and caused problems for them, or they're suffering because they weren't fast enough, they weren't smart enough, they didn't have enough money. These are understood to be the causes of suffering, and we know none of those are the real causes of suffering. Real cause of suffering is our own karma, that we've done something bad in the past, and now that badness is revisiting us in the form of some kind of bad karmic entanglement.
Well, thank you so much, Maharaj.
Mm.
Others say your fastness is your savior.
Your what?
Your fastness. How
Yeah.
fast you are is how you're going to be saved.
Right.
And others also say, well, no matter how fast you ran, you cannot hide. So it's very interesting. Govinda Prabhu, you have a question? Please, you may unmute.
Hare Krishna Maharaj, please accept my humble obeisances.
Oh, yes. Hare
Glories
Krishna.
to you, glories to Srila Prabhupada. Maharaj, I'm just wondering how you just explained how a living entity expands it's a spiritual body when is going back to God. And I was just wondering how the living entity reduces in size when it's coming into this physical forms.
I've never heard exactly how the process works, but in one place I read that Prabhupada says the living entity is, we hear that the living entity is like a spark or a tiny fleck, and then how could such a thing have a form? Well, it does have a form, and then when one is in the spiritual world, there's no such thing as bodies. We were talking about this morning. In the spiritual world, the living entities don't have veins and tubing and piping and all this complex stuff that the body has on the inside. We don't have that. It's not necessary. The spiritual forms are able to move and walk around and eat or do whatever they need to do, and they don't have to have all this complex internal wiring and mechanisms to make it happen. It happens automatically because it's a spiritual matter or a spiritual essence. So the material world plays by different rules than the spiritual world does. So the material world's rules are the rules of scientists study, you know, physics and these various limitations. And that's basically all they are, is just limitations. In the spiritual world, there are no limitations like that. There are different kinds of limitations because the living entity is limited. He's not the supreme. But at the same time, he's not limited by his body in as much as he won't get old and dry up and die, you know, like a material body will. So I'm not sure if I answered your question. I'm struggling to keep focused today. I had a really early morning and I've been a little sick lately, so I'm struggling to keep it all together. But you can tell me if you have a further question or if I answered your
Maharaja, thank you very much. See, I was wondering, you know, when we're in a spiritual world, we have a full fresh form that we associate with Krishna and, you know, cowhead boys and friends, and then when we are coming down here, then we have to be like a spark and then enter into the physical form. So I was kind of wondering, but anyway, thank you very, very much. And my next question would be, you know, we know there are 8,400,000 species of bodies.
Yeah.
So and Lord Brahma offered to the living entities all these bodies. So I was wondering, did he create all these bodies simultaneously, or one came after the other?
Well, you're talking about Lord Brahma?
Yeah.
Did he create like individual bodies or classifications of bodies, like how, you know, we had first...
like the humans, animals, trees, birds, and all that form. Did he created all these bodies simultaneously, or one after the other?
No, they weren't created simultaneously, but they were created in layers. It mentions this in various parts of the Vedas that we have, first of all, we have the great sages. So they're the first entities. Of course, first we have Brahma, then we have Narada Muni, and then we have, you know, Shiva, and so on and so forth. And there's a few important sages, and they are the first beings in the universe, and there's nothing else besides, there's no other beings. So these sages, they try to help the generation of living beings. In fact, Lord Brahma, his main task after creating the universal planetary systems, he does that first, is to populate the universe. And when he tries, he finds out he's got a lot of problems. First one he asks is Narada Muni, and Narada Muni's not willing to have children, so he loses there. And then he asks Shiva to create living beings. And it explains that Shiva creates living beings, but those living beings are very destructive. And they begin tearing up the universe, even as it hasn't been completely built. You know, it's just getting started and they're already tearing it apart. So Lord Brahma tells Shiva, please don't make any more beings, just you please meditate. So he's got a problem there. And then finally, Daksha comes along, and Daksha is going to create living entities. And he makes all these brahmacharis. And Narada Muni trains them up and tells them not to get married. So Daksha is frustrated. Then Daksha tries with a second group of living beings who are also his sons, and Narada tells them not to get married and to do what their brothers did. So then Daksha gets wise, and he has a bunch of living entities, but this time they're all girls. So the Narada Muni never preaches to them. And from them, we find out that these daughters of Daksha get given as wives to these original sages. And particularly, a bunch of them are given to, I believe it is Karda Muni. And so from Karda Muni and each of these individual wives, we have a different classification of living entity coming down. At one point, there were the fishes. At one point, there were the plants. At one point, there was the cloven hoof animals. At one point, there was animals with claws. At one point, there was, all these different varieties of creatures. So they were at different stages, they were created. At one point, there was only human beings, which is completely unlike the whole thing with Darwin. Darwin thinks that in the beginning, there was no human beings. There were only simple, one-celled beings or whatever it was. And then gradually they became more and more complex. And finally, we got to the stage where we were complex enough to have human beings. But that's not what the Vedas say. Vedas say that human beings were there from the very beginning. Well, maybe you could argue that they were above human beings, but that form was there. So we have originally human beings, sages. Those sages get married to Daksha's daughters, and through Daksha and through Daksha's daughters and various great sages, we have other population. We have the population of the various animals, that's what Prajapati Daksha daughters do when they connect with Karda Muni. So one of Daksha's daughters is the mother of all the plants. One is the mother of all the reptiles. One is the mother of all the insects. One is the mother of various other animal classifications, and this is how they get set up. Is that the question that you had? Did I answer it?
Oh, yes, Maharaj. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Govinda Prabhu, for your question. And Maharaj, thank you for the answers. Anyone else with something to share or to ask before we let Maharaj go, leave? Maharaj was sharing initially that he's a bit exhausted today. He's coming from a different program. So
yeah, what's happening is that I've suddenly become a temple president overnight, here in Freeport. We had a temple here that was run originally by people who were not really ISKCON, and over 19 years there was litigation, and the courts finally ruled that ISKCON was indeed the owner and not these other people. So, they didn't want us to come, but the courts now are not equivocal on the issue. They've made a decision. They've made a decision that actually it's ISKCON that runs the place. So we're here. We're trying to get deity worship set up properly, and we're trying to do all kinds of things. And it's been, since a week or so, I'm living not in Brooklyn, but here. Yeah. And so I'm moved, and lots of other things are happening, and it's a struggle to keep it all together.
Yeah.
And that's why a couple of days ago I had a Zoom, and it completely didn't work. Today I'm not broadcasting on a hotspot, but I'm broadcasting on the Zoom that comes out of this building, so it's much more stable.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Maharaj, for...
All right. So thank you all very much for inviting me.
Throughout the inconveniences, yes. So, Maharaj, we are struggling, devotees, but Nevertheless, we wish you well, and
Mhm.
we pray and hope that this new temple you are managing now flourishes and becomes a wonderful place.
Thank you all very much.
Hare Krishna. Thank you so much, Maharaj. So,
Hi.
on this note, dear devotees, we're going to humbly request you all to kindly unmute, and we all chant Hare Krishna Maha Mantra to express our appreciation to Maharaj's presence and speaking to us today. Jai. Hare
Hare
Krishna, Hare
Krishna,
Hare
Hare
Krishna,
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 Hare
Krishna
Krishna,
Hare
Krishna
Hare,
Krishna, Hare
Hare
Hare,
Hare
Hare
Rama,
Rama,
Hare
Hare
Rama,
Hare
Rama.
Rama
Rama,
Rama, Hare
Rama,
Hare.
Hare.
Mancha kalpata
Panchakapata Vischa
kripa
Kripa
sindhya
Sindhya
nikata
Tivacha
Titanam
Patitanam
Namaste
Pavanebhyo Namo Namaha.
Hare Bo.
Hare
Chandrasekhar Swami
Krishna.
Maharaj ki
Jai.
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 All
Hare
glories to your services. Hare Krishna.
Hare